In the 5th century before the Common Era, the ancient world witnessed the rise of two powers so fundamentally different, so ideologically opposed, that their collision would reshape the course of Western civilization. This is the story of the Peloponnesian War. On one side stood Athens, a city of philosophers and poets, where democracy had taken root and flourished beneath the shadow of the Parthenon. Her empire stretched across the Aegean Sea. Her silver coins bearing the owl of Athena passed through countless hands, and her fleet of sleek triremes dominated the waves from the Hellespont to the shores of Sicily. On the other side rose Sparta, a warrior state forged in discipline and sacrifice. Here, boys were taken from their mothers at the age of 7, hardened through brutal training, and molded into the most feared infantry the ancient world had ever known. Their crimson cloaks became synonymous with death itself. For decades, these two powers had maintained an uneasy peace, bound by treaties signed after their joint victory over the Persian Empire. But peace between rivals is fragile, and the Greek world had grown too small for both Athenian ambition and Spartan pride. The historian Thucydides, who lived through the devastation that followed, would later write that it was the growth of Athenian power and the fear this inspired in Sparta that made war inevitable. He understood that beneath the immediate causes lay something deeper, more primal, a fundamental truth about the nature of power and the tragedy of human affairs. The tensions that would ignite the Peloponnesian War had been building for a generation. Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, had transformed the Delian League from a defensive alliance against Persia into an instrument of Athenian imperial power. Tribute flowed into the city from over 200 subject states, funding the magnificent building projects that crowned the Acropolis and the powerful navy that enforced Athenian will. Sparta watched with growing alarm. The Spartans were not empire builders by nature. They preferred to dominate through their leadership of the Peloponnesian League, a network of allied city-states bound by mutual defense treaties. But as Athenian power expanded, Spartan allies grew restless, demanding action against the growing threat. The spark came in 433 BCE, when Athens intervened in a conflict between Corinth and her colony Corcyra. Corinth was a vital Spartan ally, and her grievances against Athens multiplied. Then came the siege of Potidaea, an Athenian subject state that had revolted with Corinthian support. Athenian forces besieged the city, while Corinthian volunteers fought alongside the defenders. The final provocation came when Athens issued the Megarian Decree, an economic embargo that strangled the trade of Megara, another Spartan ally. At a congress in Sparta, the allies demanded war. The Spartan assembly voted that Athens had broken the peace. In the spring of 431 BCE, a Theban force allied with Sparta launched a surprise attack on the small city of Plataea, Athens' loyal friend. The Peloponnesian War had begun. Pericles knew that Athens could not defeat Sparta on land. The Spartans and their allies could muster an army of overwhelming size and quality, trained warriors who had spent their entire lives preparing for battle. But Athens possessed advantages of her own. Her navy was unmatched, her walls impregnable, and her treasury deep. Pericles devised a strategy of calculated restraint. When the Spartans marched into Attica, the Athenian homeland, the citizens would abandon their farms and villages, retreating behind the long walls that connected Athens to her port at Piraeus. Let the Spartans burn the crops and ravage the countryside. The Athenians would survive on grain imported by sea, their fleet striking at the Peloponnesian coast while avoiding pitched battle on land. It was a strategy that demanded patience and sacrifice. Each summer, the Athenian farmers watched from the walls as Spartan soldiers torched their olive groves and vineyards, generations of labor consumed by flames. The psychological toll was immense. But Pericles held firm. Time, he argued, was on their side. The Spartans could not sustain a prolonged campaign far from home. Their allies would grow weary. Eventually, the enemy would seek terms. The strategy was sound, but fate had other plans. In the second year of the war, crowded conditions within the walls created perfect conditions for catastrophe. A mysterious plague, brought by ship from Egypt or Ethiopia, began to spread through the refugee-packed city. What followed would test Athenian resolve to its breaking point. The plague struck without warning, a horror beyond anything the Athenians had experienced in war. Thucydides himself caught the disease and survived, leaving us a clinical description that still haunts readers today. It began with violent heat in the head, redness and inflammation of the eyes, and bleeding from the throat and tongue. The skin broke out in pustules and ulcers. Victims burned with fever so intense they could not bear the touch of even the lightest linen. Many threw themselves into cisterns, desperate for water, dying of thirst no matter how much they drank. The dead piled up in temples and streets, sacred places filled with corpses. The traditional funeral rites, so important to Greek religion, collapsed completely. People threw their dead onto burning pyres meant for others, too exhausted and terrified to observe proper custom. The social fabric unraveled. Laws human and divine lost their power. Why obey the gods who had sent such suffering? Why fear punishment when death seemed certain? Crime and vice flourished, and then Pericles himself fell ill. The great statesman who had guided Athens to the height of her power, who had built the Parthenon and defended democracy, succumbed to the disease in 429 BCE. His death left Athens without its steady hand at the worst possible moment. Over the next 3 years, the plague would kill perhaps 1/4 of the Athenian population, including a devastating proportion of the trained soldiers and sailors upon whom the city depended. After Pericles, new leaders emerged to fill the void, men of a different character. Cleon was a tanner's son who rose through rhetorical skill and aggressive nationalism. He rejected negotiation with Sparta and pushed for more ruthless prosecution of the war. When the city of Mytilene revolted against Athenian rule, Cleon convinced the assembly to execute the entire adult male population and enslave the women and children. Only a last-minute reversal, achieved through desperate overnight sailing, prevented the massacre. The war ground on, year after bloody year. Neither side could achieve decisive victory. Athens raided the Peloponnesian coast. Sparta ravaged Attica each summer. Small cities changed hands. Atrocities multiplied. At Plataea, the Spartans executed all the defenders after the city finally fell. At Corcyra, civil war between democratic and oligarchic factions descended into an orgy of slaughter that Thucydides described as the beginning of a moral collapse that would spread throughout the Greek world. In 425 BCE, Athens achieved an unexpected triumph when they trapped a force of Spartan soldiers on the island of Sphacteria. For the first time in living memory, Spartans surrendered rather than fight to the death. The prisoners became valuable hostages, and Sparta sued for peace. But Cleon, drunk on victory, demanded impossible terms. The war continued. Then, in 422 BCE, at the Battle of Amphipolis, both Cleon and the brilliant Spartan general Brasidas fell. With the warhawks dead, exhausted negotiators finally reached agreement. The Peace of Nicias, signed in 421 BCE, promised to end the conflict. It would prove to be merely an intermission. No figure in the Peloponnesian War is more fascinating or more troubling than Alcibiades. Raised in the household of Pericles himself, he possessed extraordinary beauty, charm, and intelligence. Socrates counted him as a beloved student and companion. But Alcibiades also embodied a new kind of ambition, one that placed personal glory above loyalty to any city or cause. The Peace of Nicias was crumbling. Spartan allies refused to honor its terms. Alcibiades saw opportunity in chaos. He maneuvered to create a grand alliance against Sparta, only to see it shattered at the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BCE. But his greatest gamble was yet to come. In 415 BCE, Alcibiades convinced the Athenian assembly to launch a massive expedition against Syracuse, the wealthiest Greek city in Sicily. Victory there, he argued, would give Athens the resources to crush Sparta once and for all. It was a breathtaking vision of empire stretching from Greece to Carthage, perhaps even to the Pillars of Hercules. The assembly voted in favor. Then, on the very eve of departure, someone mutilated the Hermes, sacred statues of Hermes that stood throughout Athens. Religious scandal gripped the city. Alcibiades was implicated, though his guilt remains uncertain. He sailed with the fleet, but soon received word that he had been condemned to death in absentia. Rather than return to face trial, Alcibiades defected to Sparta. The architect of the Sicilian expedition would now advise Athens' enemies on how to destroy it. The Sicilian expedition was the greatest military undertaking in Greek history. 134 triremes, 5,000 heavy infantry, and tens of thousands of sailors and support troops set sail for Syracuse in the summer of 415 BCE. The force was magnificent, but it lacked unified command, and its objectives remained confused. At Syracuse, the Athenians found not easy conquest but determined resistance. The Syracusans fortified their city, received reinforcements from Corinth and Sparta, and built a fleet to challenge Athenian naval supremacy. Month after month, the siege dragged on. Athenian soldiers died of disease in the marshes surrounding the harbor. Reinforcements arrived from Athens under the general Demosthenes, doubling the size of the expedition, but the military situation only worsened. In the harbor of Syracuse, the Athenian fleet suffered a catastrophic defeat. Their ships, designed for open water maneuver, proved vulnerable in the confined space where Syracusan innovations neutralized Athenian seamanship. When the Athenians finally attempted retreat, their way was blocked. The army, tens of thousands strong, fled inland, pursued by cavalry and light troops. Stragglers were cut down. Those who reached the river Acinarus were slaughtered as they scrambled for water. The river running red with blood, the survivors, perhaps 7,000 men, surrendered and were imprisoned in the stone quarries of Syracuse. There, exposed to sun and cold, given minimal food and water, most perished over the following months. The generals Nicias and Demosthenes were executed. It was the most complete destruction of a military force in ancient Greek history. The disaster at Syracuse should have ended the war. Athens had lost 200 triremes, thousands of her best citizens, and her aura of invincibility. Her subject allies sensed weakness and began to revolt. But remarkably, Athens refused to surrender. New ships were built. New soldiers were trained. The democracy that Pericles had championed found reserves of determination that astonished the Greek world. The war entered its final phase, fought primarily in the eastern Aegean and the waters around the Hellespont, the vital strait through which grain ships from the Black Sea reached Athens. Here, Sparta made a fateful choice: to build a fleet capable of challenging Athens at sea. They turned to Persia. The great king was eager to recover the Greek cities of Asia Minor, lost to Persia after the wars of the previous century. In exchange for gold, Sparta agreed to abandon those Greeks to Persian rule. The architect of this alliance was Alcibiades, now advising Sparta, but his restless nature soon created enemies in Sparta as well. He fled to the Persian satrap Tissaphernes, then eventually returned to Athens, where the desperate democracy forgave his treasons and gave him command of the fleet. For a time, it seemed he might save the city he had betrayed. But after a subordinate suffered defeat in his absence, Alcibiades fell from favor again, this time permanently. He died in exile, murdered in Phrygia, perhaps on Spartan orders. The end came at Aegospotami in 405 BCE. The Athenian fleet, Athens' last hope, had anchored on an open beach in the Hellespont, a poor defensive position. For several days, the Spartan commander Lysander watched and waited. When the Athenian crews dispersed to forage for food, he struck. The Athenian fleet was destroyed almost without a fight. Of 180 ships, only a handful escaped. 3,000 to 4,000 Athenian prisoners were executed. When news reached Athens, Xenophonte tells us, a wail of grief passed through the long walls from Piraeus to the city, one man passing the news to the next. That night, no one slept. They wept not only for the dead but for themselves, expecting to suffer what they had inflicted on others. Lysander's fleet sailed to Piraeus. His army encircled the city. Cut off from the sea, Athens began to starve. After months of siege, the Athenians accepted terms. The long walls were demolished to the sound of flute music. Their enemies declared, as the day of freedom for Greece. The empire was dissolved. The fleet was reduced to 12 ships. An oligarchy of 30 men, backed by Spartan soldiers, replaced the democracy. The 30 tyrants, as they came to be known, launched a reign of terror that killed perhaps 1,500 Athenians in 8 months. The war that had lasted 27 years was over. Athens had fallen. The Peloponnesian War transformed the Greek world. The golden age of Athens ended not with a gradual decline but with catastrophe. The generation that had built the Parthenon and invented Western drama saw their city humiliated, their democracy crushed, their empire dissolved. Yet Athens would recover. Democracy was restored within a year. The city would produce Plato and Aristotle, Demosthenes and Praxiteles. But the confidence of the Periclean age never returned. The war's true victors were not the Spartans, but the Persians, who had financed Sparta's fleet while recovering their lost territories. And Sparta's hegemony proved brief. Within 30 years, Thebes would crush Spartan power at Leuctra, and within a century, all of Greece would fall under Macedonian rule. Thucydides wrote his history because he believed the war was the greatest movement in Greek history and contained lessons for all time. He was right. The Peloponnesian War shows us how democracies can be led astray by demagogues, how imperial overreach invites disaster, how fear and honor and self-interest drive nations toward conflict, even when peace serves everyone's interests. 2.5 millennia later, generals study the Sicilian expedition at war colleges. Political scientists analyzed the Melian dialogue, where Athenian envoys told the helpless islanders that the strong do what they can while the weak suffer what they must. The war that destroyed classical Greece became, through Thucydides' immortal account, a permanent possession of the human mind, a mirror in which every generation sees its own follies reflected. And in the ruins of the long walls, in the silence of the quarries of Syracuse, we hear an echo across the ages, a warning about the price of war that humanity has yet to fully learn.